about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro, and welcome back to Front of Mind Series 1, where we nab ourselves a guest from our broader water-sensitive urban design, urban development industry, and sit down for a chat about what is interesting them, fascinating them, puzzling them. Maybe there's a bit of puzzling in this.
Yeah.
And we sit down, we talk about that. Today's guest is Alan Hoban. Now, Al has a long history in our water industry here, having worked as a consultant, then worked for Healthy Waterways in a capacity building role, now works for Bly Tanner. And we are going to bring together in this chat two bits of recent scientific works, investigations, and talk about their consequences for policy and how we as an industry react to them. The two previous bits of work are the recent information that's emerged. We talked about this in the last episode of Ideanthro with respect to how much pollution is actually coming off our urban catchments. So this is the work that Terry Lukey, Darren Draper and Andy Hornbuckle have published, and that I spoke to Darren and Andy about in the last episode. And we're going to talk about that and then combine it with the emerging research that shows that bioretention systems behave hydrologically very differently to what we previously thought, i.e. they disappear a lot more water than previously thought. And I spoke about that in episode 213. That is the context. So Al, number one, welcome.
Thanks, Jack.
Would you like to kick us off by describing why did these two bits of research come together and interest you, and possibly puzzle you at the moment?
Yeah, look, for a number of years, and back when I was at Water by Design, someone, a very senior scientist, said to me, "Oh, is this water-sensitive urban design stuff, is it more religion than science?" And I was offended. I said, no, you're completely, of course not. But it sort of stuck with me every now and again and made me kind of think, okay, like, make sure that we're applying rigorous science to what we do. Mm-hmm. And trying to get better at applying really good science, which is in some ways taking your sort of passion or desires about what you think might be a great outcome and trying to work with the facts, even when they're slightly uncomfortable.
Yep.
So I've been increasingly trying to work with and hold space for uncomfortable data rather than dismiss it and start to let that sit for a while.
Okay.
How this caught my interest? Look, for a while I've been looking at water quality data and I've been seeing anomalies, but there've been little bits of data, small data sets and things that sit outside the normal range. And I've been doing that with some work for Townsville City Council, where we found that their concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus were statistically significantly lower than what you'd expect from all the literature on urban stormwater. Mm-hmm. So it was a bit of a puzzle, but how could that be? And then I got some similar data from Darwin for something that was happening up there, and I started thinking, is this a Northern Australia thing, for example? Or is the data wrong? So,
yep.
And so after a number of those studies, when I saw the work that Lukey et al. Had done in their 2018 paper, it started to, I guess, legitimise some of that, because I said, I've got data that fits inside this profile that they're talking about.
Yeah.
The stuff I'm seeing aren't just anomalies. They've got a large data set here covering a few hundred events. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and this is the common trend with the bioretention hydrology stuff, right? A few papers came together. It was no longer like, oh, that bit from Coomera Waters is a bit funny.
Yeah.
It was now, wait, hang on, we've got 5, 6 papers that are a bit funny.
And we're now up to 8 papers that are almost, in fact, nearly every paper we can find on the field performance of bioretention systems seems to be in alignment.
Gotcha.
Which is quite compelling.
I'll have to get whatever the other 2 papers that you've got that I don't yet have. I'll have to get them. Go on.
Press pause and I'll send you an email.
Yeah.
So look, it's really interesting that this story seems to fit that bioretention systems are disappearing 60% of the water that comes into them, even if they're lined or on heavy soils, which is a really interesting sort of thing.
It's quite confusing. I refer to episode 213 for why that's really confusing.
Yeah. So do you dismiss the data because it doesn't fit with a previously held theory or hypothesis that we've held, and really rigorous scientific method is to change your hypotheses on the basis of the data that comes forward, rather than dismissing the data. The other aspect of this that's really, I guess, had me very interested is I've now got a role through Stormwater Australia where I'm now responsible for producing the Stormwater Quality Improvement Device Evaluation Protocol. And so this looks into extreme detail, all the testing and methods that you should put in place to validate the performance of proprietary products. And there are different categories to some of the vegetated systems, but it's useful to think with that level of rigour. And so when I was looking at this data, I was thinking this is the data that you would believe if you were supporting the performance of a proprietary product. It's got that level of scientific rigour to it.
Okay, yep.
So what do we do with this data? And I was also starting to detect some really interesting responses from people across the industry to this data, which potentially threatens to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, so why don't we touch on to give this some context. So at the moment we frame this up as, hey, look, it's changed how we think stuff behaves, but that might be a bit of a, okay, so what? Like, what does that actually mean? Why don't we give an example or two of a tangible change that might mean? Like, does it, for example, should we still be treating urban stormwater? Let's make this real for people about the conundrum that we're facing.
Yeah. Well, so what the Lukey et al. 2018 work shows is that stormwater is potentially less polluted. Stormwater off small urban catchments is not as polluted as we'd been assuming or requiring people to assume in their water quality modelling.
Yep.
That's potentially a really good story in some ways. It's not saying that we don't have to do any treatment, and that part of the problem we've never really known. What are the real ecological requirements of our waterways? And there's a whole discussion there.
Yep.
So it's not assuming that we don't need to do any treatment, but it helps us think about what the real problem is and then help tailor solutions to match that problem. So it's quite an interesting one. What's really interesting is, well, why are those concentrations so much lower than the previous studies that were done?
Yep.
I think there's a couple of factors. One, a lot of the previous work was on much larger catchments where there's a bigger diversity of land uses and a range of other things taking place in terms of construction and like in the catchment. So when you get to smaller catchments, I think it makes sense that you're likely to get a potentially more homogeneous land use and fewer of those abnormal, highly polluting activities taking place.
Yeah, so it could be a case that the big catchment is comprised of this, and this.
Yeah.
And what we've now done is got more resolution on, say, this one, which turned out to be lower pollution, but maybe one of these other ones over here is actually really highly polluting and they sum back together.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess previously, one of the things that's really challenging for all of us is that the investment in stormwater quality science in Australia over the last 10 years has been pretty dismal, considering the investment that's put into the sector. And so there was some great science done last decade that helped move us forward, but that was by no means a fait accompli. We've learnt a lot since then. Well, sorry, we haven't learnt a lot, but we've learned a few things.
Yep.
So look, one of the things that's interesting with that change in data, is it just because of the smaller catchment size, or has there been a shift in our pollutant loads over time, is another question. And so one of the hypotheses that was put forward around that might be that changes in automotive fuels, we now have much cleaner fuels that we're using in our cars, has that reduced the amount of diffuse pollution coming off our catchments?
It wouldn't be incredible if it was, because I can remember, like, from the early days of water sensitive urban design, you see these consulting reports that talk about actions, and there's some treatment going on there, but there's also stuff about education or behaviour change or practice change. And that at some point, it feels to me like in the industry, it's a bit like, look, we get that those softer things are important, but we can't have any certainty about them working, so we won't give you any credit for that.
We'll dismiss those and
build treatment systems. Wouldn't it be funny if that stuff had actually been quite effective?
In fact, 10, 15 years ago, we used to have these big conversations about structural and non-structural best management practices. It's a language that we don't use anymore. And so the big push is to move to structural measures, whether they're vegetated or proprietary, and avoid the non-structural. So that's really interesting. The other thing that's really interesting, if you think about where we're at now, compared to maybe 20, 30 years ago, it's a taboo not to pick up your dog crap. Which is a really major change. Imagine 30 years ago if you said everyone's going to be walking around with a plastic bag, and if your dog does a warm one on the footpath, you're going to be picking it up. That's I think it's a really significant change. So is it possible, or I don't know many people that still wash their car on the road, all those behaviours around.
I haven't seen it for, I don't know when.
So it's possible that some of those cumulative things are also leading to that progressive improvement in diffuse stormwater quality. I don't know, but it's plausible, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got this situation now where there's this new information emerging, and it's profound enough to be like, look, at least in my opinion, we should probably be changing some of our ideas and practices. Not necessarily not necessarily a wholesale jump from, we thought that and now it's this, but to we have a bit more info as a whole. Let's change. Let's respond to that and change. What's your take on the appetite for that to occur?
Well, look, it's pretty limited, and I guess it's worth putting in the context that we've got a whole ecosystem, if you like, of policy, design objectives and guidelines and modelling tools that all work around the status quo. And they've been really effective in terms of getting people doing.
Well, if the point was to build water-sensitive urban design, at least in its bioretention form, we've been remarkably successful in doing it.
Yeah. So our state planning policy objectives in Queensland, and in fact, these objectives also apply in other parts of Australia, is have relative reduction targets, often seen as 80% reduction in total suspended solids, 60 in phosphorus, 45 in nitrogen, for example. Now, those targets are based by running music using a certain set of water quality input parameters and a certain assumption about how bioretention systems work.
Yep.
And if we've got different influent concentrations, and if bioretention systems are acting much more like a sponge soaking up water, and the effluent is not necessarily any cleaner, but we're losing a whole lot of load by soaking up that water, then the design objectives based on the previous modelling paradigm potentially need to be significantly reviewed and revised.
Yeah, because a recap for people, broadly speaking, the objectives were derived by, say, mock up a typical 1 hectare catchment of development, model bioretention systems at various different percentages of that catchment, and those different percentage sizes, so the filter media at 1%, 2%, 3%, so on and so forth, get different removals, and you get this curve of, small systems don't do much, but if you make it a little bigger, it grows rapidly. And then you've got this diminishing point of returns where it just tails off. And broadly speaking, our objectives are set at a bioretention size that's kind of around the point of inflection there and gives a size that we thought was reasonable, we could probably fit in the urban landscape. And if you read back up to the percentage reductions, look, it's 80, 60 and 45. That's how they've been derived. So of course, if the pollutant inputs are different and the bioretention behaves differently, the curve is completely different, so the entire basis for the objectives is null and void.
Well, look, null and void's
maybe a bit rough.
Well, it's potentially, yeah. Look, it really does bring into question, the validity and currency at the moment. So it's a really interesting one. So what we've been doing some work with eWater, looking at how we might evolve that bioretention node to get to better reflect the field performance that we're seeing. And so we've then been doing some simulations using music again, but looking at these different concentrations and performance, and then what would performance curves look like and what might that mean for practice. Mm-hmm. My personal view is that if we trigger a review of the objectives, it's worth revisiting the basis upon which they reside rather than a tinker. But that raises some questions because one way of looking at it might mean you can look at it two different ways. One would significantly reduce the size of bioretention systems that we're putting in place. Another way of looking at that problem might lead to them being significantly larger.
Yeah.
And so what I'm observing is a strong sort of emotive response from people, because people see this as doing a couple of things. One, if we change the status quo, it's potentially confronting, because we're potentially saying to people, I was wrong, or we were wrong, or you were wrong.
There's some cognitive dissonance in this, right? Like if you're someone who's essentially had their whole career been about doing good stuff in this space, doing good work, knowing what we're doing, and suddenly having to confront what where we've potentially been wrong. There's a real feeling potentially of dissonance there. And what cognitive dissonance leads to is us, rather than confronting things on their merit, looking for ways round to essentially confirm our current beliefs. There's an Ideanthro episode way back about cognitive dissonance. I don't know the number.
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, there's a great story of a physics professor whose whole life had been advocating a certain theorem and teaching it in lectures for decades and decades and decades. And very late in his career, some young person gave a presentation and kind of challenged that theory and presented some alternative information. This professor said, "You're challenging everything that I built my career on, but as a man of science, you've just changed my view."
Yeah, and well, there's another saying though in science, which is that science progresses one funeral at a time, which is essentially because people, like the young person comes along, has the new discovery that changes the paradigm, but then become the entrenched force with the entrenched view. And until they die, and essentially someone else with new views comes along and supplants that the science doesn't move on.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting
That's not a threat to anybody.
It's not, but it is a genuine saying.
So look, that's really interesting. So I mean, some of the responses I've observed from different stakeholders range from, look, this is really interesting, and we've needed some new knowledge to help move us along from a current bit of stasis in the industry around certain attitudes and approaches and behaviours and technologies, and this gives us a bit of an impetus to keep evolving, and that's a really good thing, because we still aren't at that utopia of water-sensitive urban design that we dream of in terms of cool green cities, engagement around waterways, all those sorts of things. We're still on that journey, and maybe this might help us take another step change forward.
Yep.
There's also a view that this is threatening, and that by potentially acknowledging that there might have been we might have not been right about it. And I'm not saying we're wrong. This is adaptive management or how science works. We do what we do with the best knowledge at the time.
Yeah, and it's okay to be wrong. Like, as long as you're doing the best you can with the knowledge you have, it's okay if in hindsight you realise you were wrong.
Yeah, or not so much wrong, but you know more now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but there's, I've sensed from some people a view that, well, this is going to either embarrass the sector or people as an individual, because they've been promoting a certain viewpoint, and this will undermine that.
Yep.
So that's a threat. That's a threat both to people's individual reputations, but also organisationally. A senior person in a local government organisation suggested that if the politicians had hear about this, they might withdraw funding to stormwater quality, saying, "Well, you guys have got it wrong, so you've now lost your chance." And so, how do you? And there's also another view about, well, you can't make big changes because to make a big change might erode industry confidence. And so,
which is similar, like it's sort of the same problem, because in one case it's saying make a big change and erode industry confidence, the other one is make a big change and erode politicians' confidence.
Yeah.
It's really the same problem at the heart of that, which is, are people going to lose confidence in us?
Yeah, that's right. I would like to think that you get greatest confidence from people by speaking honestly, being transparent about the knowledge that we have, and moving forward together in the face of that new knowledge and talking about it.
That's certainly my observation of the world. I'm going to use a really rough, and slightly pointy analogy here, but I see this as the difference between, say, if you you're in a relationship with someone that you love, and we all make mistakes at some point. And so at some point you've completely by accident told your partner something that's wrong or done something wrong to them. And you realise that it's wrong, and you now have a choice going forward as to how you behave. On the one hand, you can own up to it, they'll probably forgive you, you get on with this, and you move on with life. Or on the other hand, you then build more lies and more deceit on top of it to try and hide it. Essentially, not owning up to this new data is akin to continuing to lie to your partner. It's a bit. I realise that's a slightly pointy analogy
today.
Yeah,
so we're bumping scientists and.
This is how my brain works, though. Metaphors. So, but that's the way that I see it. I see that in personal relationships, honesty and transparency up front does best, and I don't see it any differently in our professional field, because the professional field is made up of personal relationships.
Yeah.
Like the reality is, us having a chat is a relationship. So.
I think there's a little bit of a fear some people have that that this new information potentially will just upset the apple cart and erode confidence, and we'll be back where we were in the 80s.
Yep.
I think that's unlikely. I think it's amazing the widespread support for managing stormwater quality. We've got enough good examples, and I think it's highly unlikely we're going to backslide back to that point. And I don't think this data suggests that we should.
No.
In fact, with bioretention, the new data says they work incredibly well.
Just not at what we thought.
Just not in the way we thought.
Yeah.
Which is really useful, because now we go, actually, they're really great at managing urban hydrology and soaking up runoff. And they'll still do a range of things in terms of reducing pollutant loads and adding greenery into urban environments and potentially contributing to microclimate. They perform differently, so it can potentially free us up a little bit in terms of how we design and use the technology, use it and design it according to how it works, not design it according to how we thought it worked 10 years ago.
You've previously said to me along the lines of how, if we track Alan's life through water-sensitive urban design, you've been through a phase in the past where, very, very much a fan of bioretention. You began to become less of a fan of it, and then this research has gone, oh wait, hang on, for these reasons, it's got this place that's just very different to what you previously thought.
Yeah.
But without the new research, you would either still be stuck in blind love or despair.
That's right. And now I actually think there's a much bigger place for it, and in fact, when you look at this information, it gives us hope, because it actually says we've got a far better chance of actually making good progress on these issues. So previously we thought, pollutants are up here, the technology's not that efficient, and it gets us to these points.
And by the way, hydrology is so ridiculously tough.
You can't even manage that, so that's in a too hard basket. And we're only really fiddling around the edges of the urban footprint and dealing with the existing urban areas. And what this effectively says is, actually those problems are a bit more solvable now. We can tackle those, and we can do a range of things that are going to be
the water quality
positive benefit.
Yeah, might not be as bad as we've previously thought, and the hydrology, which really is still a big problem, we actually now have a tool that's a bit more effective than we previously thought. So I think I said there's been a lack of investment in science in this space. So one of the things that's really interesting around this is people's attitudes, and we're almost in a bit of a post-science world in some of these issues, because people often see science now as being subjective, and they will believe or disbelieve papers based on who's putting forward those arguments. And in Australia, it's really interesting, there's been very little monitoring of stormwater quality data by public agencies in the last 10 years. Which is why we haven't really seen much since, the Brisbane City Council work in the early 2000s. Yeah.
So it's interesting, a 2003 data set was still seen as one of the most valid data sets.
Yeah.
But because of the requirement on vendors of proprietary stormwater quality products to do their own testing, we've now almost required a range of these companies to actually go and collect data. And so
which is, of course, where this data's come from.
Yeah, which is where the data's come from. And so we've actually, driven a number of these companies to go and collect data. And in fact, some of the best stormwater quality data sets have been collected through these testing and verification processes. But we still see some stakeholders saying, well, I don't believe your data because you're a vendor of proprietary stormwater products, and so I inherently don't trust you. And so even if the science is peer-reviewed in a peer-reviewed paper, no.
Yep.
And so that's a real challenge, I think, about how we move forward as an industry in an evidence-based framework and be a bit agnostic or blind to who's putting forward the arguments and look at the evidence on its merits.
Yeah, and this was a point that in the previous episode with Darren and Andy, and of course Andy is from Spell, who's a proprietor, but one of the points that we touch on there is exactly that. People might look at it and judge it on the basis of who collected the data, but you can also flip it around and be like, look, at least in one respect, this data is not in favour of the proprietary manufacturers, which lends an argument, like, you're reducing concentrations. If you sell proprietary treatment products and the data's showing there's less need to treat stormwater, it's a little awkward. But the point,
but this is the sort of data set you would hide if you wanted to manipulate the truth.
But this is exactly the point of why you judge it on its merits and not on the basis of the author.
And I said it aligned with some other data that we'd been seeing from other sources, which
it fits.
I wonder if it didn't align with other data I saw, would I have given it an honest hearing?
That's intriguing, and that's quite self-aware on your part to ask that question. I certainly still continue to grapple with, and I assume this comes from my time at local government way back in the day, my gut reaction to proprietary manufacturers just in general. I still struggle with that reaction of every time, and then it's like, okay, calm down, judge it on its merits.
Yeah, well, for me, working through this stormwater quality improvement device evaluation protocol, SQUIDEP, it's been really useful on that, trying to be really objective in terms of what the data's saying, and so it's been a useful process.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in what we do from this point, and what the industry does.
Yeah.
And what sort of responses this elicits from state government agencies, from local government, from consultants, developers. We've got a number of local governments that have been steadfastly applying guidelines and standards and rejecting development applications if they don't conform to the letter of things like music modelling guidelines.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult for those organisations to pivot quickly.
Yeah.
Especially once they've been entrenched in advocating a position. So it'd be interesting to see how, and what are your views on how we enable and support those organisations through a position of change while maintaining their reputations and saving face to the industry.
Yeah, I mean, so my thought on this is, it probably comes at several levels, and for me it's probably helps to come in at a very high level principles and then maybe look at what that actually looks like tactically. For me, I reckon there'd be two things here. One of which is, I don't necessarily mind, I don't feel the need for change to happen overnight, sort of throw that baby out, grab a new one, grab some new bathwater sort of situation. But so I don't mind if it takes a while for the change to happen. What I would like to see is some evidence that change is occurring and it's being taken seriously. And the way that I would make that happen is through honest conversations up front. So they're kind of the principles of set in place some stuff so it tracks in the right direction and be very honest about why we're doing it. Because similar to you, I don't think that if we went back to either the industry or, if I didn't think this, we wouldn't be making this episode, right? Because we'd be hiding it, right? I don't think that if we went back to the industry and highlighted this stuff, or went back to politicians and highlighted it, I don't think there'll be a baby thrown out with the bathwater so long as we are honest and go, look, this is really awkward because we previously with our best information thought this, and this information has changed that, and that means that in hindsight some stuff that we've done in the past looks a little silly, but therefore we need to do, like, I think that in the vast majority of cases, we won't see a baby thrown out with the bathwater situation.
Yeah.
Maybe in Southeast Queensland where there's like, 6 or 7 urban local governments, maybe one of them might be like, you know what, we're not happy with that.
I think part of the framing is language is a really important one about not saying that we were silly or we were wrong. What we've done is, for a period, applied really good science and made decisions based on the evidence at hand.
Yep.
And we're looking to actually do the same thing,
Yes.
just with current information.
Yeah.
So it's not saying that we were wrong back then. We're applying a good process with the information at hand.
Yeah.
And it's about doing the same thing now, I think.
Yeah.
So it's building on the methods and approaches and that commitment to learning by doing.
But we also do have to recognise, though, I think that the longer it takes to start doing that, I feel the tougher it becomes to do it. Because when this information has emerged relatively recently, then it's quite easy to have that conversation because you're like, look, we did these things because of the best available information, and we have this new information and doing the best things. But if you delay having that conversation, then when you come to do it, then suddenly it's a case of, we were doing these things with the best information, and 5 years ago some information became available, but we ignored it because we were scared. And now that conversation's suddenly a lot more awkward, because then someone does have a reason to go, wait, you did what? That wasn't good process.
Yeah.
That was bad process.
Well, look, we're almost at risk of that a little bit at the moment, because especially the bioretention performance research, there's some really recent papers in that. But if you look back to some of the papers back in 2009, for example, which were some of the first field applications to validate music and the FORB research, they came up with findings where, when you read it, you think, did no one else read these papers?
Although arguably, I would argue, because a lot of these findings that we're talking about in that space, we did back in 2010 or 2011 when I first saw those, flagged them, but they were one-offs and isolated. So it was like, that's weird, but we've got no framework within which to process this. I would argue that it's recently, within the past 12 months or so, that's a sad state of affairs, that 12 months is recent, but anyway, that enough of them have come together.
There's a critical mass now.
Yeah. So I don't feel so worried and awkward about that, because it's the critical mass in both the bioretention space and in the water quality loads concentration space. That it's the critical mass that's happened recently that's made it real, in my view. So
what happens over the next 2 years?
I feel like you've turned this interview round on me, Alan. I thought this was my show. What happens in the next 2 years? Surely you have to go through surely you have to revisit at a high level the thought process that got to current. So presumably, broadly speaking, the thought process that got to our current objectives were, based on the evidence, we feel like urban waterways are getting damaged. Why are they getting damaged? What tools do we have to do about it? What do we want to get built? How do we set some policy to make that happen? Surely if we step back through that same high-level thought process, we would figure out how to do something with this info. It just wouldn't be the same as now. We'd go, okay, urban waterways are still getting damaged. The data says that they might be getting damaged in different ways. Okay, the tools are a little different. Well, what do we actually want to see built, and how do we set policy to see that happen? Surely I don't know. Okay, my take is revisit the high-level thought process that got us to current objectives and see where it gets us to. What about you? What's your take?
Yeah, I'm always sort of thinking of sort of like two scenarios that could play out in a way. and maybe it's informed by some of the discussions I have with different stakeholders. So one scenario is that there's a resistance to change.
Yep.
And given the significant cost to developers as a result, that there might be a developer that's willing to challenge the current state planning policy or other frameworks through something like the planning environment court. So kind of a bit of a have some sort of test case that really revisits what's going on, and that creates an impetus to change. I think there's another one where there's a critical mass of respected practitioners in the space that keep having conversations around it, and through that process give regulators significant confidence that there's a cause to revisit something here. I'd be really keen, whatever the outcome in terms of policies and design objectives, is that we reinstate a commitment from government to fund science in this space. Because we've got some knowledge now, but we'd be folly to think that that is still enough knowledge to move forward. And so we really need to make sure we've got good baseline funding for whether it's capacity building organisations or universities or others doing applied research to keep asking questions.
So it's funny that you mentioned that, because it's just, as we've been having this conversation, something's been rattling around inside my head, and you've just made a connection to something for me. So let me try and interrogate this. Something I've spoken about previously on Ideanthro is some work that I've done for a local government where we essentially said, look, how much will it cost to get a meaningful amount of like water sensitive urban design, stormwater treatment? We need a better word besides treatment, because that infers water quality and not hydrology, but we'll say treatment. Like
management.
Let's go management. How much stormwater management do we need to get into our urban spaces to make a meaningful difference to our waterways, get them to something that we actually really like and want? And how much will that cost? And actually, how much space and opportunity do we have to do it? And I believe that when you look at that, there's a very stark realization that the current technologies aren't cost effective enough. Essentially, it doesn't scale. There isn't enough space, in my opinion, in many instances, certainly in the instances of this particular local government, to do it. And even if there was enough space, it wouldn't be cost effective. And it's happening really, really, really way too slow to happen, because it would take a couple of hundred years at the current rate to do it. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, we need better technologies, so we need innovation to happen. Well, why isn't innovation happening right now? And then you go, well, it's because most of our assets are being delivered through the DA process, which is thoroughly constraining and restrictive, that we can't have innovation. Okay, so let's step back from that. The problem here, well, if you look at it, a lot of the innovation that's happened in the past, not all of it by any means, because there have been great sites that have done cool stuff, like, and your sites included, like the Noosa Flexi Learning Centre and stuff. But a lot of the innovation in these technologies, say, like, where did bioretention systems come from? There was some research and local governments started building them. And then they came into DA and they've sat very much the same.
Yeah.
Where did GPTs come from? Some research and some proprietary manufacturers, but local governments built some. It all happened outside the DA process initially. It strikes me that in the same way that there's in science and information about how much pollution is coming off our catchments, there's money being spent in it, but it's all being spent in the private sector and nothing coming out of the public sector. The same problem is at play in the technologies that we're building, in that they're all being built by the private sector. It's great that they are building it, but in the private sector through DA, where there's no opportunity to innovate, very, very little. I shouldn't say no, because some people do good stuff, but very, very little opportunity to innovate relative to the quantum of money being spent. And no money essentially, there is some, but very little again, being spent in the public sector or in spaces where innovation can occur. Can you see the parallel I'm trying to draw there?
Yeah, I think so. But my mind was racing to a solution to that, which is
Okay.
almost saying in DA, almost comes a little bit to either offsets or headworks, but to try to take some capital through that DA process.
Yep.
So then local government can build its own
It's funny that
assets with a little bit more flexibility.
It's funny that you say that, because I have spent about 5 years arguing really stridently about why I disliked offsets, and I've, for that very reason, changed my opinion recently.
It hurts, doesn't it?
I know. Yeah, well, honestly, but let's talk about it, because honestly, this whole conversation's been about how do we change opinions. That's that. In that case, it's me. That's the best example I have of me going, my opinion was this, and oh dear, it's now this.
You know what's really interesting though, and I think this is one of the cultural shifts we need to affect in local government. What I hear some local governments saying is, if we're going to go and build our own stormwater assets, we need to apply the same standards and modelling standards and everything that we would ask of developers, because we've been asking them to do all this stuff. So on our own projects, we have to apply that same set of standards.
Yeah.
I can see where that comes from, because it's really challenging in a local government environment for them to be asking one thing of the private sector and not doing the same themselves.
Yep.
But I think it's a misplaced fear. I think people would really like to see local government showing some courage, doing some innovation. I don't think anyone's going to, crucify them for that. I think that people would welcome some responsible, I was going to say risk taking, but it's being scientific. It's trialing different things and seeing how they work and understanding what works well.
On the surface, people might look at that and be, and for want of a better word, crucify them for it. But I suspect that if people dug in and looked at that, okay, it's a choice between either we do everything completely by the book and we don't learn anything, we don't innovate, versus we do some stuff not by the book, but we learn, and that makes it better for everyone, including back in the DA process if we feed stuff back in. I think in most cases, reasonable people would be like, okay, we're cool that you're doing stuff a bit non-traditionally.
So one of the things I like about this new research, when we say do things by the book, we're effectively, that book is no longer sacred in a way. We're almost forcing people to reconsider.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a really positive thing. In no way a threat to the principles of water-sensitive urban design and achieving healthy waterways and livable communities and all those things. I think it's potentially an enabler, but we need to be. It will cause disturbance.
Yes.
In the sector, and it will potentially. It needs to be carefully managed, I think.
Yeah, but that careful management shouldn't turn into an excuse for not doing anything with it.
Yeah,
that's the line to tread.
Yeah.
By all means, be careful, but definitely do something. So, okay. Is that where we should wrap that up? That felt like that just came nicely into a little ball at the end there. So,
why not?
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Al, thank you for coming on and having a chat. If people are interested in finding you or talking to you, where do they find you?
Either through the Blytanner website, my details are through there.
Yep.
Jack can put my email potentially in the link below the post.
Okay.
But happy to take phone calls and emails anytime.
Okay, wicked. Al, thank you for the chat, and thank you as always for tuning in. We will see you next time.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask it. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.